there. I'm going to spend some time today talking about four major sources of social cleavage in the United Kingdom, and the one that I want to start with is social class. Historically, the divide between the working class and the middle class, the upper classes, has been the biggest source of political conflict, political ideology, political identity in the UK, at least since the Industrial Revolution sort of created a working class in the first place. So you can see in this poster, which is a Labour Party advertisement from 1924, that for a long time, specifically the Labour Party very explicitly articulated its identification with the working class. You could probably figure that out because it's in the name, whereas the Conservative Party was historically the party of the middle and the upper classes. That said, in the last several decades, the relationship between social class and partisan loyalty in the United Kingdom has become a lot weaker. So there's no longer necessarily a straightforward breakdown in which working class people vote for the Labour Party and middle and upper class people vote for the Conservative Party. You can see this graph shows you poll results from a poll taken in, I think, December of 2020. They ask people to identify their social class. So ABC1, those first two bars, refers to people with primarily middle class or non-manual occupations, whereas C2DE, those third and fourth bars on the chart, show you the people who are primarily identified as working class, or their jobs primarily involve manual labor. And so what you can see here is that both in terms of voting behavior in the 2019 election and what people said they would do when they answered this poll in November 2020, you can see now that working class people are actually more voting for the Tories at higher rates than they're voting for the Labour Party, whereas the middle class is sort of evenly split between Labour and the Conservative Party. So that correlation has broken down pretty significantly, and you might argue that if present trends continue, that the Tories will actually become the party with a more working class or lower income base. I think it's probably too soon to say this for sure, but there is certainly a good reason to believe that the debate over Brexit, over the UK leaving the European Union, has been a major contributor to this partisan realignment. It didn't start in 2016. It didn't start with the Brexit campaign or with the Brexit referendum, but I think Brexit has kind of accelerated those trends, although it's probably too soon to say that definitively. So here, if you see, you can see that middle class and people tend to be voting to remain a little bit more strongly, whereas there's a pretty strong majority among working class voters in the UK in favor of leaving the European Union. And we can talk a little bit later about why that might be. In particular, one of the major arguments for Brexit was that the freedom of movement required for EU membership was putting working class Britons out of jobs. We had that kind of myth of the Polish plumber that you've probably already heard about. But the upshot is that working class people tended to support leaving the EU at higher rates than middle class people did, and the Conservative Party was a more enthusiastic supporter of Brexit than the Labour Party was. And so you will tend to see some shifts in partisan voting behavior as a result of that. Another thing worth noting with respect to social class is that elite educational institutions at both the secondary and the university level are both a symptom and arguably a cause of the class divide and a lack of social mobility in the United Kingdom. So if we look at sort of primary and secondary schools, this graph shows you as of the 2019 general election, so that's the most recent parliament as of this recording, that overall 29% of members of parliament that were elected in that cycle attended fee-paying primary or secondary schools. You might have heard in the context of talking about British society and politics, the term public schools, which means kind of the opposite of what it does in the United States. Colloquially, public schools refer to a pretty short list of maybe one or two dozen fee-paying, very elite schools. Historically, these have been boarding schools that have served young men of the upper class, although many of them have changed those policies and gone co-ed and incorporated day programs in more recent decades. But these are schools like Eton and Harrow and Rugby that have really long histories of training wealthy young men from elite families for public service. So you can see from this graph, and then you can see the partisan breakdown as well, that a considerably greater share of members of parliament went to fee-paying or what we'd call private or independent schools. Those include the so-called public schools, those really elite institutions, as well as other fee-paying schools. And then if you look at higher levels of politics, depending whose administration is in charge, you'll find even higher overrepresentation of people with private school educations. So Boris Johnson's first cabinet, the cabinet he named when he first became prime minister in 2019, 64% of those people attended fee-paying schools at at some point in their primary or secondary educations, compared to only 7% of the general population in the United Kingdom. Then if we skip ahead to looking at people's university educations, again, looking at the class of members of parliament who were elected in the 2019 election, you can see that a really disproportionate share of them went to sort of very fancy schools. And this graph shows you the comparison between members of parliament versus the working age population in the UK as a whole. Oxbridge refers to just Oxford and Cambridge, widely regarded as the two most elite universities in the United Kingdom. That group, the Russell Group, is a broader term for sort of elite, highly selective research universities. So those are the really selective schools in the UK, and they include the Oxbridge schools as well as a number of other universities. And then you could also see that just MPs as a whole are much more likely to have university degrees or to have had some university education compared to the general public in the United Kingdom. Since 1721, when the office of Prime Minister was first recognized, there have been 55 different Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom. 28 of those people have gone to Oxford. 14 of those people have gone to Cambridge for their university education. So there's a really significant kind of tradition of, old boy elitist politics in the United Kingdom. And that remains, I think, a really significant factor for people who argue that this is not a society which is, entirely meritocratic or has total social mobility. Second big source of social cleavage in the United Kingdom is regional or national identity. So you recall from our history lecture, I hope, that the UK is made up of 4 constituent countries or regions. Those are England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And within each of those, I'm going to focus today on Scotland and Northern Ireland because this is where these issues tend to be the most salient. But there are varying degrees of support for some separatist movements, so people calling for Scottish or Irish or Welsh total independence from the United Kingdom. And then there are movements that are calling for increased autonomy. So they don't necessarily want to carve out a separate identity as a sovereign state, but they do want more decisions politically to be made at a local level rather than at a UK-wide level by the Parliament in Westminster. An interesting way of collecting data about people's identity is to just ask them, as the 2011 census in the UK did, how do you identify your nationality? Would you describe yourself as British or Irish or Welsh or Scottish or something different? And you can see here mapped the results. Basically on these maps, the darker the color is, the greater share of people in a geographic area identify themselves as British on the left, or then looking at this map on the right, as English in England or Scottish in Scotland or Welsh in Wales. And so you can see, there's not actually a majority of people who identify themselves as British as opposed to having a regional or national identity. So majorities in each of these regions said that English or Scottish or Welsh was their main identity as opposed to British. If you look at the group of people who do identify themselves primarily as British, they're more likely to be non-white than the general population, and they're also more likely to be young. Young people tend to embrace the British identity more than older people do. Scotland is the region of the UK where this issue of national identity unto itself has been the most significant and the most politically turbulent in recent years. So let's look at Scotland for a little bit in detail. A variety of reasons why, if you live in Scotland, you might be inclined to favor greater autonomy or even total independence for Scotland. A couple of sources of nationalism in Scotland. One is that the country has a long and distinctive history and culture. Scotland was independent until 1707, when the Acts of Union created the United Kingdom, and out of Scotland, plus what had previously been England and Wales. But those Acts of Union left Scotland with its own legal system and religion, the Church of Scotland, and its own cultural traditions. And so there is a distinctive sense, right down to the language that people use for just very ordinary events, of identity or of difference between Scotland versus its neighbor to the south. There is, in the 1960s, oil deposits were discovered in what would be Scottish waters if Scotland were in a sovereign country in the North Sea. And that helped create the sense that Scotland, if it wanted to go it alone, could potentially be able to actually support its economy through this important natural resource. There are some significant differences in sort of political culture and ideology between Scotland and the UK as a whole. Scottish voters, and I'm speaking, of course, in broad generalizations here, tend to be somewhat more left-wing wing than voters in the UK as a whole. They tend to have stronger support for social democracy and for a stronger welfare system. And you can see that, since certain powers of administration have been devolved to Scotland, there have been policy differences that reflect that. So, for instance, Scottish students don't pay any tuition to attend university in Scotland, whereas English students do pay some share of their own tuition. The state provides a greater share of healthcare expenses in Scotland through the National Health Service than it does in England and Wales. So there's those differences in political culture and ideology. Which were, by the way, exacerbated when Margaret Thatcher came into power and started implementing these neoliberal reforms. They were sort of uniquely unpopular in Scotland, and a lot of Scots viewed those reforms as kind of a direct attack on their identity and their autonomy. So that's when you started to see a number of people in Scotland really resent rule from London. And then, of course, more recently, Brexit has intensified those political cleavages between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Scots voted pretty overwhelmingly, I think by 60-some%, to remain in the European Union in the Brexit referendum. And so there's an increasing sense in Scotland that they have been kind of dragged out of they're being dragged out of the European Union against their will. On a more sort of technical level, devolution, that process of handing more authority to elected regional legislatures that started under Tony Blair, has effectively resulted in strengthening the Scottish National Party, which is the largest organized political group that calls for Scottish independence. So in the first two regional elections for the Scottish Parliament, the Labour Party dominated, and that makes sense given what we know about the difference in sort of political ideology in Scotland. But then starting in the early 2000s, Labour lost a lot of popularity in Scotland for a variety of reasons, one of which was that Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, took the United Kingdom into the Iraq War along with the United States, and that was particularly unpopular in Scotland. So Labour lost a fair amount of public support in Scotland as a result of that. Their decline in support was generally voters moved over to the Scottish National Party. And so you can see in 2007 that the Scottish National Party claims a plurality for the first time and forms a government in 2007. And then if you look down to the 2011 election, the SNP actually gains a bare majority. By one vote, they gain a bare majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament. This is particularly remarkable because the design of Scotland's electoral system is explicitly intended to prevent any one party from gaining majority. There's a mixed system where you have some amount of proportional representation, and that's the point of that, is to stop to make majority control really difficult to gain. The SNP has been the plurality party since then, the last couple of elections. They haven't regained a majority since 2011, but they've been in government ever since then. And so that's given them a local power base. And I haven't shown you the results of Scottish elections to Parliament, to the Parliament in London, but the SNP's share of those seats has gone up correspondingly. And so devolution has really strengthened the one party that is most aggressively calling for independence. In 2014, as a result of the increased power of the SNP and the increased popularity of Scottish nationalism in general, the Parliament consented to have an independence referendum, and the government in London campaigned aggressively against this, but it went ahead, and in 2014 that referendum failed. Scots voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. And so Scottish independence was dealt a significant blow there, but the flip side was that the major parties in Parliament agreed at that time that they would respond to the significant support for Scottish independence by committing to even further devolution. Right? So the result of that was not independence, but additional autonomy. As I said, the Brexit referendum has kind of reignited calls for Scottish sovereignty, for Scottish independence. The Scottish government keeps saying, the SNP government keeps saying that they're going to demand a second referendum. It hasn't happened yet, but keep an eye out for that in the future, because Brexit has again exacerbated those tensions and kind of fueled that fire. Okay, source of social cleavage number 3, race and ethnicity, which are very closely tied in the British context with immigration. What you can see in this graph, which covers the period between 1964 and 2019, is that net migration into the United Kingdom has been rising over that period. And there are two basic sources of immigration into the United Kingdom. So the major sources are, number one, European member states up until Brexit took effect recently, because being a member of the European Union meant that the UK was committed to freedom of movement between EU member states for EU member state citizens. So you saw lots and lots of people coming in from other European Union member states into the UK looking for schooling or looking predominantly for work. The other major sources of immigration to the UK are what we know as Commonwealth countries, which are mostly former British colonies. And there are linguistic and historical and educational ties between those countries that mean that if you live in India or Pakistan or Nigeria, it kind of makes sense if you were looking for schooling opportunities, if you're looking for job opportunities, if you were looking to be with family who have already immigrated, that you're going to move to the United Kingdom. So if we look at a survey was done in 2019 of people who were immigrants in the United Kingdom, their countries of birth. And among those, you can see India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and South Africa, all Commonwealth countries, all former British colonies. The results has been, number one, increasing racial diversity in the United Kingdom. The population of the percentage of Britain's population that was not white British has gone up from 8% in 2001 to 14%. That's an estimate from 2016. And along with that have been concerns about racism and inequality and police violence that will sound familiar if you follow American politics at all. So in the last couple of years, for instance, you've seen Black Lives Matter protests in the United Kingdom, not just in sympathy with the movement in the United States after the murder of George Floyd, but also in response to police violence against people of color in the United Kingdom. You've seen a movement calling for Britain to reckon with its past, both in terms of its administration of a colonial empire and its involvement in slave trading going further back in history. And so that remains an ongoing source of social cleavage, is Britain's failure to adequately reckon with racism, with its own colonial past, and to provide equal treatment for people of color living within the United Kingdom. Number four, religion. And some of this is tied up with national identity. Some of this is tied up with immigrant status. Some of this is tied up with race and ethnicity. It's worth noting that the United Kingdom has an official church known as the Church of England or the Anglican Church. This is the established church in the UK. It's not mandatory to be Anglican in the United Kingdom. And in fact, only 12% of the population identifies as Anglican. And it doesn't receive explicit state funding. But there is a lot of sort of, the monarch of England is officially the head of the Church of England. There are 20-some bishops from the Church of England that sit in the House of Lords by default, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some of those more symbolic links, although it is by no means sort of the officially enforced religion. A couple of general long-term trends in religious demography in the UK that are worth noting. Number one, as you see in a variety of sort of wealthy Western countries, there's been declining identification with Christianity. In 1983, 2/3 of people in the UK identified themselves as Christians. In 2018, that number was only 38%. Correspondingly, and this is very much tied up with immigration to the UK, there are increasing numbers of non-Christian religious people in the United Kingdom, and there are also increasing numbers of people who identify as having no religion whatsoever. Two contexts in which this is particularly relevant. The increasing number of Muslims in the United Kingdom is the first one, and then religion in Northern Ireland is the second. So thinking first about Islam, as you probably noticed, thinking about the countries that are major sending countries for migrants to the United Kingdom, there's significant numbers of Muslims who are moving to the United Kingdom, and there are increasing numbers of British-born Muslims in the British population today. You can see from this map that the population of British Muslims, and this map just shows you data from England. We don't have a corresponding map for the rest of the United Kingdom, but you can see that the population of Muslims is concentrated in some areas in the United Kingdom, not evenly distributed throughout the country. There's a few cities that have really significant Muslim populations in the United Kingdom. London is an obvious one. Birmingham is another. And on average, Muslims in the UK they're younger, they are lower income than the general population, and they're more likely to live in the cities than the British population as a whole. There have been what I think your textbook refers to kind of in a kind of banal manner as growing concerns about the integration of Muslims into the United Kingdom. One of the factors that accelerated this or really brought this to public attention was what was known as the 7/7 attacks, because they occurred on July 7th in 2005, when terrorists who claimed to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda set off 4 coordinated bombs on mass transit in London during rush hour. They killed 56 people. I think about 400 were injured. And so what you saw as a result of that was growing attention, which had already started after the 9/11 attacks in the United States, to counterterrorism and to radical Islam in the United Kingdom. And as your textbook says, growing concerns about whether this increasing population of Muslims in the United Kingdom was in fact being integrated into British society as a whole. So there's been increasing attention paid in the last 20 years or so in the UK to counterterrorism, to radicalization. But it's also worth noting that the far right of British politics, parties like UKIP, and then some elements of the Conservative Party as well, have increasingly embraced Islamophobic themes. And I apologize for making you look at this collection of bananas headlines, but the British tabloid press, which tends to, the right-wing British tabloid press, has been really active in kind of pushing this really alarmist narrative about things like alleged no-go zones, which are areas where they claim that non-Muslims aren't allowed to go in British cities. My favorite among these is the idea that halal food is being pushed on unsuspecting British citizens. And so this is, I think I should hasten to say, total crap. But those kinds of themes, those kinds of Islamophobic themes, have actually contributed to some degree of popularity for far-right British political parties. So this is one area in which I think religion is going to continue to be really, really salient in British politics as a source of social cleavage. The other place where we have seen for a longer time religion as a major source of social cleavage is in Northern Ireland. Here's the backstory, and I'm going to abbreviate this pretty significantly. The British have had a political colonial presence in Ireland as far back as the 12th century. And their settlement kind of intensified in the 16th and 17th century, what's known as the Tudor conquests of Ireland, during which Britain extended its political control in Ireland as a whole. And also Protestant settlers, many of whom were from Scotland, were actively encouraged to move to Ireland. And those folks ended up primarily in Northern Ireland. So the upshot of that was that Northern Ireland had a greater concentration of Protestants than the rest of Ireland, which was and is predominantly Catholic. There is significant anti-Catholic discrimination in Ireland under British rule. And in the early 20th century, that kind of resulted in increasing support for home rule or for independence in Ireland, as we've seen in Scotland more recently. So the result is that Ireland is partitioned in 1921. There's a creation of what's now known as the Republic of Ireland, encompassing what you see shaded in white on this map in the south. So that's now a sovereign independent nation. But 6 counties in the north, which had a greater concentration of Protestants than the rest of Ireland, remained part of the United Kingdom, and that's what we know as Northern Ireland, or sometimes Ulster. So in Northern Ireland today, the basic political dynamic is that there's a divide between people called Unionists and people called Republicans. The Unionists support a closer union with Britain, or the United Kingdom, and those folks are predominantly Protestant. The Republicans, on the other hand, support unification of Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland, which would mean independence from the United Kingdom, and those folks are predominantly Catholic. And I think it's worth underscoring here that this is not exclusively or directly a religious divide. These folks are not primarily out there arguing about transubstantiation or the Latin Rite. This is a political divide overlaid onto a difference of religious identity, and they're really inseparable. So I think it would be a gross oversimplification to say that the conflict in Northern Ireland is strictly between Protestants as such versus Catholics as such. Those tensions in Northern Ireland started to escalate in the 1960s when a group called the Irish Republican Army, which supported a reunion of Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland, and which was incensed by what they perceived as continued discrimination against Catholics under British rule in Northern Ireland, started a series of terrorist attacks against British installations, against various artifacts of British control. And in particular, they tended to target British military installations or checkpoints at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And so you saw sectarian violence with the British military and with a variety of illegal Protestant paramilitary groups that supported that were loyal to British rule. You started to see sectarian violence over a period of several decades. Over the course of what's known as the Troubles, about 4,000 people, mostly civilians who had very little to do with the conflict, lost their lives. The Troubles came to an end in 1998 with a political settlement known as the Good Friday Agreement, or sometimes the Belfast Agreement, which was negotiated with significant American support. Some key elements of that agreement included, number one, the IRA agreed that they would renounce violence. It took them another 7 or 10 years to do it, but they agreed in principle that they would give up violent political activity, that they would work peacefully through the political process, and that ultimately that they would disarm, they would give up their weapons. And similarly, the Protestant paramilitary groups were supposed to do the same thing. There had been a devolved legislature at Stormont for Northern Ireland since 1921, which had obviously been suspended during the Troubles under British rule. But that legislature was restored and elections resumed for that under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And then, worth noting, because it's going to come into question once we get back to Brexit, border controls were dismantled. So under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, the British dismantled their checkpoints at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So you could really just walk through, no customs controls, no passport controls, etc., because those border controls had been a major flashpoint for violence and tensions. So that ended most of the violence. That led to a significant decrease in the intensity of conflict in Northern Ireland. But I think it's also worth noting that devolved government has not been nearly as functional in Northern Ireland as it has been in Scotland. There are continued tensions between Republican and Unionist parties. The political situation is really complicated in Northern Ireland. They have that kind of mixed electoral system that makes it difficult for any one party. And there are a bunch of different features baked into the political regime in Northern Ireland that are supposed to require power sharing so that, if Unionists get 51% of the votes, they don't wield 100% of the power. What that has resulted in is that when the Republican and Unionist parties fail to compromise, the devolved government just doesn't function, and decision-making reverts to parliaments in London during those periods. So devolution has been a key element of the political compromise there. It hasn't always worked to promote, an actual fully functioning devolved government in Northern Ireland. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for now, and I'm just going to suggest that in preparation for our next meeting, you try and think about the interaction between the regime change that devolution entails and the social cleavages, some or all of the social cleavages that I've talked about here today. So you might want to think about some ways in which devolution operates to stabilize the UK's regime, to hold it together, and some ways in which devolution works to destabilize the UK's regime, to increase pressures for separatism or autonomy or independence or political tensions. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.